Okay, I think we're ready to get started. There are a few seats in the front row, and we've added a few around other places. Again, on behalf of the Dismantling Racism Working Group, we want to welcome you, the Dismantling Racism Working Group of the Sisters of St. Joseph and Associates. We want to welcome you all here today on this Martin Luther King Day. We are so honored to have Mary Moriarty with us. Kate is a member of the working group, so she's going to give the formal intros, but restrooms for people who aren't from Fond du Lac Village. Probably the easiest way is just to go back around the dining room and by the elevator. There are 2 restrooms. There's a drinking fountain there. And we'll have time for a little Q&A at the end. Mary said she likes to move around when she talks, so we're going to give her the cordless mic to get started. And Kate, give the formal intro.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you everyone for being here. It's wonderful to see you. I am so excited to introduce to you someone I have just come to, well, I can just go out and say it. I love you, Mary. I do. I have great admiration and have learned so much from Mary Moriarty, who is the first female chief public defender in Hennepin County. Yes. I knew this crowd would particularly love that. But she also has made it a great part of her job to come and speak to people about her views about race in the criminal justice system. And that is an issue that is near and dear to many, I would say, to the hearts of everyone here. So in addition to the Dismantling Racism Working Group, I would say that this also applies to the Criminal Justice Working Group, an issue about which I've learned a great deal from the Justice Commission. And in introducing Mary, I want to read something from a book written by Jim Wallace, who is a white male evangelical minister and teacher, and he's a man who is speaking about race as he has seen it. He grew up in a small town, and he was asking a lot of questions about race when he was growing up. And he found that not only could people not answer those questions, he noticed they were very uncomfortable about it. So when he was old enough, he took himself and his questions to the big city, and there he had the great fortune to meet a co-worker. They were both working in manually operating elevators, and on their breaks, they would ride each other's elevators. Now this co-worker was African American, and he invited his Jim to come to his house and have dinner, and his friend's mom just, welcomed Jim with open arms, and he learned so much about what it was like to grow up African American in the very same city where he was working. So that stayed with Jim all of his life, and because after the 2015 incident where Dylan Roof went into an African American church, prayed with them, and then shot up a number of people, he said, we have to talk. So he wrote this book called America's Original Sin, Racism, White Privilege, and the Bridge to a New America. And there is a part in there that is just, I think, beautifully written. He says, the ultimate answer, this is a discussion about race and the issue of faith. The ultimate answer to the question of race is our identity as children of God, which we so easily forget applies to all of us. And the political and economic problems of race are ultimately rooted in a theological problem. The churches have too often baptized us into our racial divisions, instead of understanding how our authentic baptism unites us above and beyond our racial identities. Jim's question is, do we believe what we say about the unity of the body of Christ or not. The New Testament speaks of the church as one body with many members. Another version of 1 Corinthians 12:26 reads, "If one part of the body suffers, all the other parts share its suffering." What would it mean to share in the suffering of our sisters and brothers of color who are subjected to a racialized criminal justice system? I read that as an introduction to Mary's talk because I have learned a great deal from her about the experience of people of color in our justice system in the Twin Cities. So Mary, I invite you to come forward and bless us with your presence.
I am really honored to be here, especially on Martin Luther King Day. And I'm also honored, my favorite probation officer, Mike Condon, is here. My mother, Linda, is here. And two friends that I haven't seen for a very long time, except for Sarah, we saw each other in the middle of the street a couple of months ago. But Jack and Sarah and Paul Meyer are here. So I'm thrilled. By the way, you can ask questions at any time. I don't mind being interrupted at all. I want this to be interactive so that you can get what you want out of this. So obviously it's Martin Luther King Day, and so I went through and I picked some quotes. It's pretty remarkable that Martin Luther King has so many wonderful quotes. These are just a few about justice. So I went through and I picked out some of these. Oops, sorry. Sorry. And for those of you, like I can't see a lot of things without my glasses anymore. Here, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. And I'm sure Martin Luther King would have said her today as well. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one affects all indirectly. Commit yourself to the noble struggle for equal rights. You will make a greater person of yourself, a greater nation of your country, and a finer world to live in. This is a picture of him when he was booked in, when he was arrested at some point. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America was the right to protest for rights. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And I think that's particularly relevant to these times right now. And then finally, however difficult it is to hear, however shocking it is to hear, we've got to face the fact that America is a racist country. So a segue into a book here by Bryan Stevenson. How many of you have read Just Mercy? It's fantastic. I highly recommend it to you. Bryan Stevenson has been up here in the cities a number of times. If you see that he's coming up, you should go see him, hear him speak. He's a civil rights lawyer, and this book is outstanding. What he did later, or he came up with the idea for a national memorial for peace and justice. This is in Montgomery, Alabama, and it just opened last year. And what they did, actually, was go around everywhere they could find in the country where someone was lynched. And they got jars of soil from each place where someone was lynched, and they have that. Right here, these are actually markers that have the name of an individual who was lynched in this country. Lynched in this country. Yeah, each one of these. And so I haven't been there yet. I was supposed to go there in December. I'm going there in April. But I think it's going to be you ever can get yourself there, I think it would be very worthwhile. Okay, so Brian Stevenson wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times that was published. Louder? Okay. I feel like I'm shouting. Okay, louder. Okay. So Brian Stevenson wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times, I think it was in last week, and he was asked, what would the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King think about America if he was alive today? And here is Brian's answer. When he found out that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail and prison, when he saw the level of poverty, when he heard some of the rhetoric that we frequently hear, I think he would be heartbroken. But I also think he would be excited that if he called a meeting, thousands would come. And that's what has to happen even without Dr. King. That we have to be willing to make that commitment so that we can create a world where if Dr. King emerged, he would be so proud to say his dream has finally been realized. We're not in that world yet. So I've actually spent most of the last week in Atlanta, where it was 63 degrees, by the way. With my favorite group. It's called Gideon's Promise. We founded this group 12 years ago, this organization, and we train public defenders all over the country. So I spent the last week doing training down there in Atlanta. This is us after most everybody left for the airport because of the shutdown, and there were lines at the airport. This is our group hug, and that's me right there. So this is a fantastic organization, but it was actually founded by a husband and wife. Husband's name is John Rapping. His wife is named Ilham Askia. They have 2 fantastic kids, one of whom is right here, Lucas. Lucas is 10 years old. He is a wonderful, wonderful young man. Very respectful, just a fantastic young man. He asked his father, which is kind of funny, what do you want to be, Dad, when you grow up? And his dad, John, said, I don't know, what do you want to be, Lucas? And Lucas said, I want to be, what was his favorite football player at the time, no longer, or a homeless person. And John said, why do you want to be a homeless person? And Lucas said, so I could know what it was like and be able to do something about it. He's a remarkable young man. Here's what happened to him last month. He was in school, he's a 10-year-old boy, and there was a substitute teacher. He's the only black child in his class, and he was a 10-year-old boy, right? A little playful, rambunctious. And guess what the teacher said to him? If you don't improve and shape up, you're going to end up in prison. Oh. You're going to end up being convicted. You're going to end up on drugs. Yeah. That was never ever said to any white child in that class. Never. So, about 2 years ago, actually, in January, I made the only New Year's resolution I have ever kept in my life. And that was, because normally they're about losing weight and all that sort of stuff, right? But I decided that I wanted to normalize conversations about race within my sphere of influence. And I have kept that. And being part of Gideon's Promise has exposed me to friends from all over the country who've had different experiences than I've had. And I have become very painfully aware of a lot of the privilege that I have. I am privileged, and as Kate said, I'm the first woman to be Chief Public Defender, but I am very humbled to be Chief Public Defender. I realize it's a privileged position, and I want to use that to talk to people about some of my experiences. So this is a map of Minnesota. I was actually born in Benson. People know where that is? Danvers, yes I have. Small world, right? Okay. I also lived in Grand Rapids and Bemidji, and then we moved to New Ulm, which is down here, and actually New Ulm is where I grew up. And then I went to McAllister, right down the street from here, and then the University of Minnesota Law School, and I've actually been a public defender since then for 29 years. So I looked at the census data and discovered that this was the racial composition of New Ulm. 97.8% white, which wasn't a big surprise to me actually, because I don't remember seeing any people of color in New Ulm growing up. I remember there were people talking about diversity because we had, I believe, if I recall this correctly, 3 Jewish families in town. That's what I remember people talking about. I was a big basketball fan, a big Michael Jordan fan. And so I used to watch Bulls games. I loved Michael Jordan. And I remember when I went to college, my first year I played basketball and softball. We took a trip, a spring break trip, where we all piled in a van, the softball team, and we drove to North Carolina. And I remember vividly when we were being driven up to our first game in North Carolina. I looked out the window and I saw the team we were about to play, and they were all black women. What reaction do you think I had? They're gonna beat me, yeah. Literally, they were gonna wipe us out. That's exactly it. But actually what was interesting to me looking back on it, it was actually a physical reaction. It was a pit in my stomach, oh my God, they're gonna be really good kind of, it wasn't even really a thought thing, it was a physical reaction. So we ended up winning by the 10-run rule in that game. And when I talk about that, sometimes people will say, well, what's so bad about that? You assumed, you made an association that they were good athletes. What is wrong with that? I'm giving you a hint that there is a problem with that.
What is the 10-run rule? I don't know what that is.
Oh, I'm sorry. We won by many runs. We won the game. They were not very good athletes.
This is basketball.
Softball.
Sorry.
That's okay. No, everybody's fine.
Softball. Okay.
It's okay. It's okay. So what's wrong with that? It is a stereotype, but isn't it a positive one? It's a stereotype. Yeah, no, I'm hearing not necessarily. What's the downside? What's not necessarily? Can you say more about that?
Well, there is a presumption that someone, African American, Black, comments about that their bodies are different, and so they will put it on the physical, which includes slavery.
And and what is that? What are our stereotypes or assumptions about what Black women aren't? Smart, because don't we have stereotypes about athletes?
Right.
Any athlete, actually. And what else? Not smart, not musicians, not all kinds of things that they could be, right? So that was a stereotype. And it was a damaging stereotype. And where that came from for me, and for all of us, because I'm going to tell you, everybody in this room has implicit bias. Absolutely everyone in this room. But let's talk about what implicit bias is. So implicit bias is really without our knowledge. It doesn't mean we have racial animus, okay? Doesn't mean that at all. It functions automatically. Our brains function that way, and I'm going to explain more about that. They are associations or stereotypes, as we talked about, that affect our understanding, decision-making, and behavior. So what does the research tell us? That implicit bias is pervasive, much more so than explicit bias, which is what that says. It is a different mental construct. So if you're wondering, what is explicit bias? So can somebody give me an example? What do you think explicit bias looks like?
With your knowledge.
But what with your knowledge, right? So can
You're
you say more about
aware.
that?
You're aware, self-aware.
You're self-aware of it. Can somebody give me an example of that?
White only, anything.
White only anything. Yes?
I was just gonna say hiring someone because of their gender or.
Right. So hiring somebody, let's say we want to hire somebody who's white and not somebody who's black because we believe that the white person is better at whatever. We agree with that, we think that way. That would be explicit bias. Very different from implicit bias. And implicit bias is very predictive of our behavior in the future. This is interesting in our court system too. Research tells us that when white people are aware that they might be influenced by implicit bias, they want to be fair. They don't like that idea that implicit bias might affect their decision making. This is very important in the criminal justice context because for a long time, and not only criminal justice, how many of you have heard the idea that we've had in the court system, we need to be colorblind? In fact, we can't talk about race. I mean, I've heard judges say, we don't want to open that can of worms, right? No, we don't, we want to just not talk about it. What the research says is that's incredibly damaging because we are depriving jurors, in this context, of allowing themselves to check their implicit bias. If we're not putting it out there and saying, hey, we all have this and it could be an issue here, people aren't thinking about how do I make sure my decision isn't impacted by this. Okay, so there are a couple of really interesting implicit bias, some research. This one was, they were trying to figure out how it was that orchestras were primarily made up of men. And they did some interesting tests. First, they started out by having auditions of people behind a curtain. And so the person who was doing the evaluating could not see the gender of the person who was trying out or auditioning. And that helped somewhat. But this is what I find really fascinating about that. They went another step. They realized that many of the women were wearing heels. And that even with the curtain, the person who was doing the evaluating could hear the person walking in with heels and still made the assumption, implicit bias, that it was a woman. So they put down carpet or took away the heel, I don't know what they did. But that meant that the numbers of women who were making it onto the orchestra increased as well. And I think that's a pretty fascinating test. And you can see when they had these blind auditions, the percentage of women in orchestras rose from 10 to 35%. And if you assume, and this may not be a safe assumption, but if you assume that the people hearing the auditions were not explicitly, or they didn't explicitly believe that men made better musicians, that this is all implicit bias. Another test, the studies that they've done, they've taken the same resume and they put different names on the resume. One would be Connor, which many people would tend to assume is white. The other would be Jamal, and many people would assume that person was not. And they would have people evaluate, they'd have the same people evaluate those resumes. And the person named Connor with the same resume would get the job offer many more times than Jamal, even though their qualifications were exactly the same. So those are two interesting studies. Now, I said that this is how our brains work, right? This is a book that explains that. It talks about how our brains work. He talks about two different systems. It's like the fast part of your brain, that's why it's called thinking fast and slow. So the fast part of your brain and the slower part of your brain. What does that look like? So I'm standing here and a lion walks through the door. And I'm I'm going to react. So our brains, the fast part of our brains are really about how evolution protects us, right? So I see a lion walk in the door, my association, my implicit association, is that that lion is a danger to me. And so I might run over here and push Mike and Katie in front of me and hide behind the chair, and I would feel fear, and I would be afraid that my life was in danger. So what if I'm lying there on the floor and I pushed Mike and Katie in front of me, and someone says, hey, that's our mascot. It's a completely domesticated lion. Then I'm feeling foolish, lying there on the floor, and my slow part of my brain gets that. When I'm here again and I see that lion come through the door, my association is different. And this is just how our brains work. Because we are, and this is, so the next slide. So the implicit associations we harbor in our subconscious cause us to have feelings and attitudes about people based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, age, and appearance. So this is what's interesting. So these associations develop over the course of a lifetime, beginning at a very early age. And in addition to early life experiences, the media and news programming are often cited origins of implicit associations. So if the idea of our fast brain is just association, and it's to protect us, we make mistakes. That part of our brain makes mistakes all the time, which is okay, because do I want to be standing up here thinking, you know, is that lion's ears back? Does he look like he's hungry? Do I think he might be domesticated? No. When I'm parsing through all of that, taking time, I might be dead. So my brain says, protect yourself, get out of there. And it's wrong a lot of the time. So the part of our brains that allow us to make fewer mistakes, to be really thoughtful and intentional, is very different. So in the association, the implicit associations that we make are dependent in large part about how we're raised, what we're inundated with through the media. What do we see in the media that affects our brains? What do you think? And causes implicit bias. I'm hearing whispers over here.
Depends on what you're looking at.
Depends on what you're looking at.
A lot of commercials that are showing these exact stereotypes that
Yeah.
enforce the subconscious implicit bias.
Yeah, so commercials that enforce that. Anything else that anybody can think of?
There's more crime in certain parts of the city,
More crime in certain parts of the city, committed by whom?
non-white people.
Yeah, as public defender, I have a big problem with the way the media portrays crime and violence and that kind of thing. What else?
Black on black violence, but never white on white violence.
Right. So we're kind of passive. I mean, we're inundated with this stuff all the time, right? It's in our brains, even if we're not aware of it. I mean, we can, I suppose, choose to try to limit what we're inundated by, but we're still hearing this everywhere. Anybody familiar with this study? Yeah, it was a study where what they did was take young children and young white and black children, and they had a white and black doll, and they would say, which is the good doll and which is the bad doll? And what did the research say? That not only white kids would pick the white doll as being the good doll, but black kids would too. I mean, how awful is that? You're a black child and you are asked which is the good doll and which is the bad doll. And you are picking the white doll as the good doll. So, is that child racist? Yes. Why?
Because they're making a decision based on their color.
Making a decision based on a color. Any other views on that? There's not a round answer here, by the way. Yes?
Why would you pick up the dolls by the head?
That's a different different presentation. Yes.
I don't know that it's racism. I think it's what they see, what they're told. And there's that whole thing, black, white. White is good, black is bad, you know. So I don't know that it's so much them having, you know, even an idea of racism. It's just that it's white, and white is, you know, considered good.
So this is an example of implicit bias on the part of this black child, right? So the question then becomes, do we consider implicit bias racism? I hear it is, and I hear no. And this is always what happens when I ask this question. Some people will say yes, some people will say no. And I'm not sure that there's one answer here. I'm not sure that there's one answer. When I do ask people, so when I had that reaction on that spring break trip, was I being racist? And it's okay, you can say anything you want to me. Okay, yes, I was. Anybody else? So what was the difference? Is there a difference if we assume that my reaction was based on implicit bias, as is this one? Is there a difference?
You're an adult.
I'm an adult. What does that mean?
You've had a lot more experience, a lot more opportunity to think it over.
I've had a lot more opportunity and experience to think it over.
To question.
What?
To question.
It's a
No.
question.
Well,
To question
to
my
question.
assumption.
Yeah, if you were in college or high school,
Yep.
you would have had, hopefully, in the educational system, an opportunity to question.
That's a big assumption. Despite the fact that if you called, and I don't know how long ago this was, if you called New Ulm High School, they would tell you, thank you for calling the best high school in the state of Minnesota. I will tell you my education was very lacking on race. And that doesn't excuse me from trying to educate myself, but I didn't learn about a whole lot of stuff I didn't learn about any of the stuff I'm gonna talk about in high school. Yes?
But you know, we're setting up an ism, and that already makes us respond. I mean, we haven't decided racism, or as someone famously said, when did liberal become a dirty word? And someone else said, when did America first become a bad, idea? So we've already set parameters of judgment around that and made it, none of us wants to be racist because it's an ism.
Well, right. I think we could all agree we don't want to be making assumptions based on stereotypes. Is that right? We could all agree on that. But we do. Every single one of us does. I continue to do that even though I do a lot of work on this and I work on myself. But because of my upbringing, and I'm probably guessing some of you as well. Minnesota, and this always strikes me when I go someplace else. I go to Atlanta. Often when I go to Atlanta, I take the train to downtown. And the first couple of times I was on it, I was looking around thinking, there's something really different here. What is it anyway? And it took me a while and I was like, oh, I'm really in the minority here. I rarely have that experience here in Minnesota except for court. Yeah. So many of us grew up in greater Minnesota, and our towns and our cities are primarily white. How often do we surround ourselves with people of color, of other nationalities, ethnicities? Many of us have grown up that way, so we have this baggage that I think it's important to acknowledge because it doesn't make us bad people. And I think that goes to a little bit about what you were talking about. How many of you have taken, yes?
Well, I was just going to say, I consciously have lived in North Minneapolis for 47 years, and when Murderopolis was going on, and I have black families and other families that are middle class, educated, college professors, et cetera, around me. And yet during that time, all of a sudden, I found myself one time just sort of associating black men with not caring about their children. And yet, then I looked out the street, across the street, and here's a daycare. And I see every day black dads dropping their kids off, picking them up, we live half a block from a park. I see that. I consciously live there so my children would grow up in the diverse, because that's the future of the world. Is already complex. So it's really very deep inside. You know,
It is.
because the media was feeding it at that time, also with all the negative stuff. And living in North Minneapolis, when do you ever see anything positive about North Minneapolis?
Right.
And all the wonderful parks and all the wonderful organizations and people of all kinds working together.
Right.
Very, very seldom.
How many positive images of people of color do we see? And the problem with growing up in primarily white areas, or if our work is white, our neighborhood is white, how often do we get to interact with people of color and have positive experiences? Yes?
You know, I have an observation about the previous slide of
Yes.
the dolls.
Yeah.
For one thing, it looks like the person who was holding the two dolls, that looks pretty light skinned, so it might have been a white person. And the black doll has a very dark shade of black. I'm just thinking if it were lighter skin, would that have made a difference? And sort of, you know, I volunteered in elementary school in St. Paul, and it's mostly minority children, but still predominantly white teachers. So you know, that's an important feature too for black children.
Can you tell me a little bit what difference do you think it would have made? Why do you think it would have made a difference if the doll was a little lighter skinned?
Because I just watched the TV show Blackish last night, and it was a whole half hour of skin color, how that affects people's lives.
It does, and actually I have a slide about that as well. I think perhaps the important piece here is no matter how dark the skin is here, it's darker than this. And consistently, children would associate the lighter color with positive things. Are there any other, yes?
Well, when you think about it, we were all brought up with white half with a good cowboy and a black half with a bad one. The devil's black and the angels.
We can't hear the people
Okay.
that are speaking.
Speak up, kids.
I say we've had that around us since we were born, I think. All the movies are the good cowboy wears a white hat, the bad cowboy wears a black hat. And angels are with lovely colors, usually white. And the devil is almost he is always white. And then the black witch and the white witch.
Mm-hmm.
It's just,
Yes. Pervasive, yes. Yeah. You know, and, oh, yes, sorry.
When we mention recent cultural problems that we have right now, we are mentioning recent cultural problems that we are experiencing, but America has 400 years of racial bias ingrained. It is so subtle, it's in the dirt. It's in everything, in every system. It has been enculturated, glorified, iconoclast. It's there, and it's so hard to see it.
That's a great point. Some of it is subtle, some of it's not so subtle. Yes?
I think sometimes we put racism where we really are not even thinking of racism, and that's happened to me. We had hired black people as well as white people, and I had to let one of them go because one of our people was stealing money and we ran short of money, so I said to the black woman, because of the position she had, we can no longer have you, but as soon as we get money, I'll call you back. Now, I loved her. I just loved her. But what did she do? When I said that, she went down the courthouse or wherever you go where discrimination supposedly reported. And I had to struggle a lot because I was accused of racism. And I was accused because she wasn't Catholic. I had no idea what religious beliefs she had. But she accused me of being racism. And we had another person where the same thing happened. I loved her, but then she went and kept reporting. And I just feel sometimes we say racism where there really isn't any. And one time I was very sick and I couldn't put on my coat. And I was in a store trying to buy a coat, whatever. And I went to a black woman and I said, "Would you help me put on my coat?" And she walked off. She said, "No." And I guess sometimes we forget that the white people are also discriminated.
You know, that last example actually reminds me of something that I was talking to a friend of mine who works for Gideon's Promise. And we were talking about racism. And she said, she was talking about her grandchildren. And she said she has a 15-year-old grandson, very dark skin. He has been raised to help other people. And she said she was at the airport with her grandson and son-in-law, and they were waiting for baggage, I think. And there was a white woman standing in front of them. One of her bags was here, and it fell over. And the white woman did not realize that the bag fell over, and the 15-year-old grandson started to reach down to pick up the bag. His father stopped him and said, "No, don't do that." And his grandson was like, or son was, what are you talking about? And as my friend Dr. Sharon explained to me, the father said, "She doesn't know what happened. If she turns around and she sees you with your hand on her bag, there could be a scene, and we're not going to go there." I can't even imagine what it's like to be raised, to be helpful, to be kind, but to be told, don't put yourself in that situation because this white woman might make an assumption about what you're doing. How do you live that way? You know, it's like this duality that you have to function with when you're black or brown, because you don't know what assumptions are going to be made. You've all seen that in the news, assumptions that are made about what black and brown people are doing or have done when it turns out they haven't done anything. But we make assumptions. So I don't think we can forget that. I don't think we can forget that at all. So, how many of you have taken the Harvard implicit bias test? I recommend it to you. If you go to Project Implicit or you look on your computer, you Google Harvard implicit bias test, it's really interesting. And it's based on associations. And you can do it at your own computer. It's anonymous. It's really good to do for two reasons. One is that you get to find out some information about yourself that's usually kind of disappointing for most of us, because you realize that you do make, if you don't already, these implicit associations. The other really good thing about it is it's like this virtual laboratory, and they use the research there to help. So I highly recommend that you take it. The way that it works, you see a face here that's a black face, and the idea is you're clicking on, you're doing keystrokes, and you're identifying good, bad, that kind of thing. I actually got to hear one of the inventors of this, Anthony Greenwald, talk about it. And he said the first time he took it, he thought, there must be some horrible mistake here, because it says I highly favor Europeans. And so he took it again, and he got the same result. And then he took it again and got the same result. So you can't game it, but it is really helpful to identify what kind of associations you make. And they have a bunch of different tests. You can do them on gender, on weight, on all kinds of other things. So that might be helpful. So what's the impact of implicit bias in the criminal justice system? So jurors of one race tend to show bias against people who are accused who belong to a different race. And for me, as chief public defender, this is great cause for concern, because unfortunately, a high percentage of our clients are black and brown, and most of our jurors are white. So I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to describe what they did, which goes to different kinds of skin colors too. They did a test. They had 20 pieces of evidence, same evidence, okay? And they had pictures of a robber, somebody with a mask, a hat, holding a gun, and they had gloves on. The only thing that was different in the pictures was the color of the skin on the forearm. It got progressively darker, okay? So mock jurors were asked to look at the same 20 pieces of evidence with a picture where the only thing they could tell about the race was the forearm. And what did this show? Jurors ranked masked gunmen with darker skin more likely to be guilty. Same 20 pieces of evidence, so we're just talking about the color of the skin. White jurors recommend higher sentences for black men. We actually don't have jurors here that don't recommend sentences, but this is true of judges. Judges sentence black men and women to more harsher sentences. White people are more likely to view black people as angry or threatening. This is a huge issue in schools too, by the way, where young black men and women are perceived to be older, more aggressive, and that's how they end up getting kicked out of school, and that's when people talk about the prison or school to prison pipeline. But think about this in the context of a jury. If I have a client and we are saying whatever happened was self-defense and he's black, how are the jurors perceiving him? More likely to be angry, yes?
Why are juries more predominantly white? And, you know, I can think about, is it because of, we all have an equal chance in society to get called up on jury duty, but it's because people need to go to their jobs, and so what are some of the reasons we don't have a more of an equal color?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that question. We hear this concept of having a right to a jury of our peers. We have certainly had a number of clients who have wanted to have a trial and looked at this jury of their peers and turned to their lawyers and said, is that offer still available? So, I don't want to get into the weeds on this. Legally, if the system has a process that should be race neutral, it does not matter if a panel comes up and they're all white. As lawyers, we can't successfully challenge that because the law only allows us to challenge the process, the overall process. Now, some judges don't like that and will send that panel down and get another panel. I could probably talk for quite a while on this, so I don't want to go too far down there. What I will also say is, we, as lawyers, we get to remove jurors in what's called a peremptory challenge. And theoretically, we can do that for any reason, as can the prosecutor. But there's been a huge problem with prosecutors removing black jurors. So you start out with few black jurors, and then you have prosecutors removing remaining ones. And legally, they're not supposed to do that, but legally, it's kind of hard to make the argument that they should be there. So all of those things combine to assure us that our clients really aren't going to have jurors of a jury of their peers. And I can certainly talk to you about it more afterwards. But I could talk about it for a long time, so I don't want to go completely down that rabbit hole. Yes?
I had a sister that worked.
No, you need the mic.
Some years ago, my sister worked in Hennepin County judges, and her job was to evaluate and recommend sentences.
Oh, she's in
Yeah,
probation?
for the judge. And she told me that she thought that plea bargaining was the black person's worst enemy because of that reality. She had young clients, maybe 19 years old, who had maybe 15 priors on their record. And when she talked to him, it became clear that he hadn't done any of those. But he had plea bargained every time because he was afraid of the system. And I just want one other thing.
Sure.
Another sister, more recently, was working with a young man who was black, who was ticketed. There was a family emergency, and he was speeding, and he was ticketed on his way. And so he was going to pay he had a substantial fine. And she said, well, you have a reason, you could contest this. And he said, oh my God, no. He wouldn't even think of it. And she said, I have a friend who's a lawyer, would you talk to her? And he said, well, okay. And he got off. And he was absolutely dumbfounded. His family came to her and said, we can't believe this happened. We didn't know this would ever happen. So I think that the bias is so deep in the judicial system right now that I don't even see how black people can get justice.
Thank you. I'm actually going to be on a panel Wednesday night about racial disparities in police stops on equipment violations. Oh, is that what you have your hand up, Mom, for?
Oh, please.
My mother has a question.
All right, she gets to ask. She wanted to ask. I also have a question. You just want to know.
Oh, no, my mother has a question.
What is the percentage of white to black people in Hennepin County?
I'm getting to that slide, huh? I will repeat it, but I have a slide on that. But before I lose my thought here, so the reason I brought up that panel was that I'm trying to think of solutions. There are huge racial disparities. And by the way, Minneapolis Police Department has a one-of-a-kind in the country dashboard that any of you can go on, and you can look at the disparities in stops by date, by precinct, for equipment violations, all this stuff. So any of you can go and look at that. But here's the deal. Sometime into my career, the United States Supreme Court decided a decision called WREN, W-H-R-E-N. And what the court said was pretext stops were legal. Now that means this: a cop can see somebody in a car, and it might be a young black man, and the cop wants to stop that young black man, hoping to see if they can search them and find something else. If they can articulate a legal reason for stopping them, it doesn't matter that that's not the real reason, okay? So that's where we come up with these equipment violations and moving violations. So let's say I'm a cop and I see Mike driving down the street, and I think, I want to stop Mike, see what he's up to, see if he has a gun, drugs, what have you. I'm going to follow him for a little bit. Cops will tell you it takes 3-4 blocks for them to find some reason to stop you. How many of you signal your turn? I can't remember if it's 200 feet or something. I mean, there are really technical things you have to do. How many of you ever rolled through a stop sign? All of that. They can follow you, and I've had cops say 3 or 4 blocks, they'll find a reason to stop you. So if I just follow Mike, and I wait until he does something like that, and then I pull him over. If his lawyer wants to challenge this, let's say we find drugs in his car and he gets charged with that. If his lawyer wants to challenge that, you can't challenge. We've been deprived of the legal argument where we can say, Judge, the reason they pulled him over was not I mean, yeah, they justified by saying he didn't signal his turn, but that was simply a pretext to stop and see what's going on. That is legal, and that's a problem. And so that's one of the reasons why I think we have a lot of disparities in stops as well. Yes?
She was talking about the composition of the jury.
Oh.
Everyone is not eligible for the jury. Convicted, your civil rights.
Yeah, if your civil rights are, okay. So you can be on a jury if you have a prior conviction, if your civil rights have been restored. Correct. Okay, so, yes. I'm getting to your question, Mom.
Yeah.
Okay. My mom and I were talking about this panel that I'm on Wednesday nights, so now she's stuck in her head about questions to ask about the composition in Hennepin County, and I'm getting there. Okay, so, you know what? You know what I love about this crowd? So I gave a presentation like this to a group of 100, you guys know what I'm going to say, aren't you? A group of 100 undergrads in the sociology department at the University of Minnesota. And I said, who are these people? What is this movie from? And not one knew. An entire 100. I feel so good. I'm pretty sure most of you know, right? Yeah. So this is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And who are these actors? Yeah, none of them knew that either. And I didn't even have the wherewithal to say Sundance Film Festival or Popcorn or anything like that. So Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were real life. But what did they do? What was their career? Robbery. Outlaws. Robbery. With guns. Sometimes murder, right? But how did we, the movie-going audience, perceive them? What do you think? Romantic heroes, good guys. Why is that? Because they're so cute. Yeah? What? The Robin Hood mentality.
So, the piano.
They played the piano. Do you remember the end of this movie?
Oh, yeah.
What was the end? What was the end?
They're killed.
No, that was a different part of the movie when they jumped into the river. So in the movie, they're both wounded, and they take refuge in a mission. And unbeknownst to them, they're in Bolivia, by the way. They run down to Bolivia. Unbeknownst to them, the entire Bolivian army is collecting outside. And basically, they decide they're just going to shoot it out because they don't realize the whole army is there. So, is this coming back now? They open the door, they go out, guns a-blazing. What's the last scene in the movie? They're shooting. It's a freeze frame, and I have this poster in my room of that for some reason. I can't quite remember. In real life, they were killed, but they didn't show that in the movie. Why? They're too cute. What did you say? They would have destroyed the image of them as heroes, right? So this is part of how popular culture affects us, right? We're talking about underdogs, and I mean, these days, who would they be portrayed by? Yeah. This is the face of the war on drugs. Do you feel good about this image? Are you okay with putting this person in prison? Or jail? Seems like it might be a good idea, right? These are the images we were all bombarded with during the war on drugs, which actually hasn't ended in many ways. But I tend to think we could not have done this to people if that's how they were portrayed. But by otherizing people, making them look like this, it became acceptable to send them to prison. The same way, you all remember when Reagan was talking about welfare reform, and what was the imagery he was using?
Deserving poor.
He was talking about, yeah, the deserving poor, and the deserving poor were not, and he used this language, strapping young bucks eating steaks. Yeah, yeah. So when you think about the images that that creates, did then welfare reform seem like a good idea to a lot of people? So this gets back to implicit bias, right? These images that we're bombarded with, the messages that politicians send us and the media send us. Yes?
Well, sometimes you don't even think you're racist, you know, I thought I wasn't racist, but, you know, I was walking down an alley by myself, and there were some young black men talking in the alley, and racism kicked in, you know?
Yep.
And I thought, now, should I keep going?
Yep.
You know? And so I just kept walking like I felt normal. and nothing happened, you know, so it really helped me get over it. But I thought, too, if they were young white men, I'd be just as afraid. Probably.
But if they were young black women, how would you react?
Well, women wouldn't scare me.
Well, see, that's the point. It's
But
not
that's
so much
that's
race
sexism.
as it's not so much race as it is
Sexism.
gender. Yeah, yeah.
Well, we don't know, I've been here real long.
We can have this, we'll have this debate.
But it's based on experience.
Well, experience, but also what we're told by the media, stereotypes too. Okay, so when I'm down in Atlanta, I gave a bunch of presentations down there, and people always say to me, "You don't sound like a Minnesotan." Yeah. And I talk, Fargo. I talk about Minnesota nice, which they've all heard of, and I said, it kind of means we're nice to your face, but we can tend to be a passive-aggressive crowd. It sort of doesn't have very direct conversations, might stab you in the back a couple of times, but we are nice, right, to people's faces. So I'm going to show you another definition of Minnesota nice. Just in case some of you can't see this. Minnesota nice also protects the state's racism with the eye-rolling indignation when called out for saying or doing something racist, be it a person or a policy. Anybody ever been in that place or seen that happen? Somebody calls somebody out and says, that was insensitive, that was racist, and then what's the response?
I'm not racist.
Why do you always have to make this about race is one of the responses, right?
The other one, I got into a great conflict with someone that lives in my residence, and it was making a delineation between someone that is blocked from another country as opposed to someone who lives here and was born in the United States. And it was quite a discussion several times.
Yeah. I have found, I said 2 years ago I had this resolution about talking about race, and I've had the opportunity actually to talk about race all over the country. Where are the two places it's been most difficult for me to talk about race? Minnesota, yep. Where else? Wisconsin, Iowa. Seattle. What do the Twin Cities and Seattle have in common? What?
Well, we have the best place to live. Seattle, Viking.
We have the best place to live for white people. Have you seen lots of studies about how we have the highest racial disparities about in practically everything? Education, home ownership, wealth, all of that, health. Yeah, yeah. But what else does Seattle and Minneapolis have in common? Liberal. Perceive ourselves as being progressive. It is very difficult to suggest to people who perceive themselves as being progressive that they may not be as progressive as they think. It is painful. I can tell you it's really been painful for me. I actually wrote a little blog post about this, but I'll tell you a little bit about this. So in Gideon's Promise, our core faculty, there are about 6 of us, 2 black women, a Latina, and me, the women. And last year, we were down in Atlanta, and we were walking to dinner one night. And I always jaywalk, if nobody's coming. I mean, I look, I'm not stupid, killed by a car, but I don't, if I don't care if the light's red, if nobody's coming, I jaywalk. And so we're walking, I'm standing with my friends Patrice and Delia, and I see the light red, and I'm cold, and I look, and there are no cars anywhere, and so I'm halfway across the street, and I realize that they're back on the other side. And I turn around, and I'm just like, what's up? What are you guys doing anyway? Why aren't you guys coming? And they both looked at me, and they said, we don't walk until the white man tells us to, and in the traffic signal. And I was still, okay, so I do this work, right? I'm working on myself, and I still didn't get it right then and there. And I'm like, chickens, I mean, I was just being ridiculous, actually. It's embarrassing. I'm embarrassed about it, but I'm sharing it with you because I think we need to get to that point where we can talk about this. And so I get to the other side of the street, and we go to dinner and all of that. I wake up in the middle of the night, and I think, oh my God. It was like white privilege, the light bulb went off, and it was like, this is just awful. I have the privilege to be able to jaywalk whenever I want to. And 2 very dear friends of mine don't. And they tried to tell me that, and I still didn't get it. So I thought, what am I going to do about this? And then I thought about a term that I heard a couple of years ago at a conference on race. And the term was white grief porn. White grief porn, which I never heard of before. But I think you've probably seen it. It is when we as white people do something racist, which I did, and we make it all about ourselves. And then the black person, an often black woman, has to take care of us because we feel so bad. And so I thought, well, I need to do something about this because I feel awful about it, but I can't make it about me because Patrice and Delia are caretakers, they're fantastic people, and I knew what they would say. They're like, they would say, we know you, Mary, you didn't mean it, but that's not okay, that's not enough. No, I didn't mean it. I didn't, but it was still awful. And so I talked to them both, and I said, I need to apologize about this, and they both said, about what? And I explained, and they said, we know you're hard, all of this. And I said, but that's not enough. That's not okay. And I'm not saying this to you to get you to make me feel better about myself. I've got some work to do. I've got some work to do. And so we need to get to that point too, that we can acknowledge that yes, we do these things, we continue to do these things, no matter what our intentions are and the work that we're doing. And when we make a mistake, we should own that and not make it about, tears and make me feel better because I'm really not a racist and you know that. So that was a huge thing for me. Okay, so this is important. This has kind of been running through this. So we judge ourselves on our intent, and we judge others on their impact. So that's where, when we start talking about racism, all of us, this happens a lot. It's like, I didn't intend. I'm not a racist, I didn't intend, right? I think we need to get to the point where we assume everyone's good intentions. Most people. I mean, not everybody, it's pretty obvious who those people are, but let's assume everybody's good intentions, and let's skip to impact. Yep, we're all good people. We didn't mean to be insensitive or racist, but we were. What is the impact? And really focus on that. So about 2.5 years ago, one of our young lawyers of color was on a jury panel. And all judges ask people on perspective, who are prospective jurors, do you know any judges? And our lawyer raised his hand, but he wanted to be on the jury. He didn't want to out himself and say, I'm a public defender, kick me off. So he just said, I know judges. And the judge said, well, how do you know judges? And he said, not personally, but from around. Guess what the judge said to him? In front of the other jurors. You must have a record. Here in Hennepin County, 2 years ago, we have still not received an apology from that judge. We raised it with court leadership, and there was not, and I'm sure that judge was talked to, but he never reached out to our lawyer to apologize. So I called our lawyer that day when I heard about it, and I said, how are you? And he said, when the judge was saying this, it was like, I really couldn't believe he was actually saying that. But then he said this, I'm fine now. Just another day in the life of a person of color in Hennepin County. And when I heard that, it was kind of a crushing sort of, wow. Because we tend to think of these issues as being in Louisiana, or Alabama, or Georgia. We don't think of these issues as being here in Minnesota. But I thought, I really do. I'm never going to understand what it's like to be a person of color, but I need to do some work to try to understand what that must be like as much as I can, given my privilege. This is a cartoon by Steve Sack from The Strip, my favorite political cartoonist. So what does this mean? So this is critical because this talks about the different reality for people of color. When you have a child of color and they get to be of driver's license age, you have a conversation about what they can do to survive in interaction with a police officer. And when you have a white child, that's never the conversation you have. So I got about 5-10 minutes left. I'm gonna skip ahead here a little bit. Brene Brown, I'm a huge fan of hers. She's written a number of wonderful books. She talks about our collective story being a story of white supremacy. And the important thing about it is, when we deny that, which we do, we continue to do, it defines us as a country, as individuals. But if we can own the story, we can write a brave new country. So this evokes a lot of reaction to people. And this is Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem. But here's the deal. When you look at the history of the national anthem, and you understand that it was written by Francis Scott Key, who was angry at people who were enslaved, who joined the British because the British promised to free them. This is a black colonial on the left. The black colonial Marines joined with the British because they could be set free. And they invaded Washington and burned Washington. And it was when Francis Scott Key saw that, that he wrote the national anthem. This is the third verse from the national anthem. When he talks about no refuge could save the hireling and slave. That's what he's talking about, the colonial Marines. So if you are a black or brown athlete, what do you think about the fact that we play that before sporting events? Does it not put a different spin or a different frame on what Colin Kaepernick did? So in Minnesota, I want to run through this quickly because we tend to think that these things happened elsewhere. This is land once held by Native Americans. This is the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. We took young Native American children in Minnesota involuntarily away from their parents and sent them off to boarding school so that they could be assimilated into our culture. This is one of the reasons why native languages are dying out, because they weren't allowed to speak their native language. You can see their picture. Their hair was cut, they were made to dress this way. They were trying to make them be white. And there are people in this community who were the victims of this. In Duluth, a mob dragged out 3 black young men and lynched them. In Duluth, out of the jail. There's a memorial to them up in Duluth. In Mankato, the largest mass hanging of Native American, of anybody in history, in Mankato, which was authorized by Abraham Lincoln. Minnesota had, and think about this, when you hear politicians talk, sometimes you will hear them say, Minnesota has among the lowest incarceration rates in the country. This is true, but within those incarceration rates, we have among the highest racial disparities in the country. Probably, I think it's second highest racial disparities in the country. In our prison, in Minnesota, African Americans make up about 6% of the population, 37% of our prison population. In Minneapolis, population is white, 64%, black, 19%. But who gets arrested? 59% are black, 23% are white. So in Hennepin County, African Americans make up 12% of our population, 53% of jail inmates. So you can see these racial disparities. You should look at this website, We Are All Criminals. I think Emily Baxter created this. She was in Minnesota for quite a while. 1 in 4 people in the US has a criminal record, 4 in 4 have criminal history. Meaning that most of us at some point in our lives, as juveniles or older, committed something that would be considered a crime. But because of our privilege, many of us did end up with a conviction. So I like this slide a lot. For those of you who don't know, this is Snoop Dogg, Martha Stewart, who is the person with the conviction, although I do think that Snoop does have a conviction somewhere, a misdemeanor conviction. But, you know, if people looked at this, they'd make the assumption that he is the one. They would never guess that Martha Stewart has a conviction. So, that's what I have. Are there questions? Okay.
First, I want to take time to thank Mary Moriarty. Thank all of you for your questions so far. I was told that there was a misunderstanding. Some people thought that this started at 1:30, so some folks were here a little longer, and I want to be respectful of your time. But I also know there's still more questions. So I want to see if people would like to have maybe 10 more minutes of questions with Mary, or if we're ready to do the evaluation. So how many would like a little more time, 5 minutes with Mary for questions? I see a few more questions. Okay.
I'll stay as long as you
Okay. Yeah, maybe we could stay as long. There is also an evaluation. We'll start passing that around. We want to hear what people think, what they thought, what kind of questions still are arising in people. And I also want to let you know that on February 11th from 6:30 to 7:15, that will be the next peace prayer, which will be in Our Lady of Presentation. Yes. And that will be on a book written by a local author, Resma Menachem, talking about racialized trauma in our bodies. And people who look like I do tend to think other people have racialized trauma, but the fact is we all carry the history of the racism in which we've been raised. So talking about, that lizard brain or that part of our brain that tells us to run, we might think that there's nothing we can do about it, but his book is about listening to that part of ourselves and being able to change the narrative that that brain tells us is not correct. So it's really about how we heal from the lies that we've been raised with, so that we're not helpless, we actually can make a difference. So, Mary, do you want to take 2 questions? 2 questions while we're passing around the,
There were quite a few questions.
yeah, also maybe,
Like I said, I'm here.
okay, all right. Hang on a second, I will come over here.
Thank you. I take a little exception about a kneeling football player there because that's a verse of the Star Spangled Banner that I never have heard before. I didn't know it was there, and I taught kids the Star Spangled Banner. Sung by memory 3 verses of it, no, unfortunately, but that was in my past. But I just wonder how many people know that verse.
They don't, and that's part of the problem,
Yeah,
isn't it?
well,
And they don't know the history about the context in which Francis Scott Key created the national anthem, because that history isn't taught to us. And if you know that history, then I think it's easier to understand why African Americans in particular would object to that song being played before events.
I think it's very appropriate that he kneels.
Is there any effort in the state of Minnesota to reduce the morass, the trap of fines and fees and that start someone, they can never get out because while they're in jail, their child's payments are, accruing and then they have to, well, you know what it is, but all of those fees that are
Yes.
so...
Yes. So last year, driver's licenses are a huge issue here. As most of you know, it's hard to get any place here unless you have a car. So we have situations, and many of our clients are in this situation, where they drive, they get pulled over by a cop, and they get a fine because they have some kind of equipment thing. They can't afford to pay the fine. Their license gets suspended. They drive because they have to drive, and then they get charged with driving after suspension. So last year, there was actually a bipartisan bill that did pass to address some of this, but because it was part of the omnibus bill, Governor Dayton vetoed it, even though he believed in that. We think that's going to pass this year. But yes, in the recession, so there was a period of time where the legislature made up fines and fees and surcharges for everything. And I think the goal there was to really try to fund the justice system on the backs of the people who were in it. And that does create a huge problem for our clients because there's so many hidden fees out there. It does make it very difficult. But then you have really wonderful probation officers like Mike here who work with our clients and try to eliminate some of those fees.
Does he have discretion? Mike, can you do something?
Do something, Mike.
I do have discretion, and it is up to me in terms of how I want to enforce that with people. But what Mary talks about here today, I've always taken to heart in the sense that I understand what my clients, the inability that they have to pay and the trap that the driving creates. And my conversation with them is usually around the fact that not that it's illegal or that they have to make the payments, is that the more the behavior continues, the deeper the hole gets, and so therefore it becomes far more difficult for them to ever dig themselves out. That's the conversation that I have.
And that is actually because Mike and probation, they don't have any control over driver's license. And I say Mike is my favorite probation officer, and he is because he does go to tremendous efforts to work with our clients, but there are just some things he has no control over.
I guess I was wondering, sort of along that line, what
elements or what is happening in Hennepin County in the public defender or the county attorney's office to address some of these? Are there other efforts?
Yes. Actually, for the last couple of years, we have had a really amazing partnership with the Minneapolis City Attorney's Office. We actually just worked together, and the deputy at the City Attorney's Office wrote a grant, and we got $50,000 from the MacArthur Foundation to get our clients rides to court and to appointments in our office. Yeah, really cool. Really, really nice. And because transportation can be a huge issue for our clients, among other things. It's, I think you mentioned plea bargaining being horrible. So many of our clients take pleas because they can't afford to come back to court. They don't have vacation. They don't have childcare. There's so many barriers to come to court. So working with the city attorney's office to get that grant is a wonderful thing. We've also worked with them on other projects. We have what's called sign and release. So if somebody misses a court date and a police officer encounters them in the community, it used to be that they would arrest them and bring them to jail. Now on certain types of offenses, they'll give them a new court date and quash the warrant. So we have had a wonderful partnership with the city attorney's office. I'm going to be really honest and say I don't think the Hennepin County Attorney's Office has really made much of an effort to look at many of these issues. Jack.
I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about what I and maybe others would call strategic racism. And what I mean by that is you did such a wonderful job talking about implicit bias. But I'm talking about that as a kind of coded language where we've moved beyond the N-word, we've moved beyond even naming blacks. Instead, our politicians talk about criminals, they talk about welfare, they talk about things like that. And it's all, I think this has been the Republican strategy for 35 or 40 years. I think Bill Clinton engaged in it as well.
Yep.
So that feeds that implicit bias. It draws out that implicit bias.
It does. I actually, in different presentations, talk about the war on drugs. John Ehrlichman, who was advisor to Nixon, was tape recorded. He didn't know he was being tape recorded. And he said that the war on drugs was a war on black people. Because the Republicans didn't think that black people would vote for them.